All right, we come now to letter B in chapter 2, the king and the believing prophet, verses 17 through 49, the remainder of this chapter. So let's get into this. First of all, we say the king and the believing prophet, and then in verses 17 through 23, we have Daniel's prayerful trust. From the outside looking in, it seems like Daniel was risking everything. But if one has the right faith, it is the opposite. Trusting God is never a gamble. Not trusting Him is when we are truly in trouble. You think of Esther. Will she go and stand before the king? Oh, she's risking everything. Well, if she was there for such a time as this, not doing what she was supposed to do was the terrible gamble. And it is no gamble to go against God. You lose every time. So, we see the prayer, first of all, in verses 17 through 19. This is exciting because there's not panic involved here. We think of that song, "Oh, what needless pain we bear," all because we do not carry all our problems, everything, to God in prayer. And so we break this up even into verses 17 and 18. We see what was shared by him. So let's read those verses. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. He and his friends. I don't know, there's something inside of us that wants to take care of something all myself. But no, he was not proud in this. He grabbed his friends and they got together. They were going to desire mercies from the God of heaven. They were going to desire mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish. So they didn't go to God for an answer necessarily. In a way they are, but it's like, oh God, please tell us what the answer. They went to God for mercies from, and then it's the God of heaven. Now this is also interesting too. God had dwelt between the cherubim on the mercy seat, but now that they're in captivity, God was now, this term seems to be more in relation to the exilic time of the scriptures, where God is now the God of heaven. However, he is not a God that is far off, but he is approachable. Even in this foreign land, they can still go to their God, because no land is foreign to God, with him being everywhere. So the God of heaven, they wanted mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret. They had proved him before and found him faithful. You think of Job, who learned in chapter 15, verse 13, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." They had found him faithful before. If they had gone along with the crowd before concerning the eating of meat and drinking of the king's wine, I wonder if we would ever have heard of Daniel. We might scoff now and say, well, sure, if God provided me with miracles like that, I would live for him too. But that would be a little hypocritical. God provides miracles every day for those that will stand in those hard times. Daniel wasn't in a hard time every day of his life. He had days that were harder than others, like us. And we are faithful. We'll see God do wonderful things as well. It was probably easier because of the pulse incident, but here, once again, they had to prove God. I don't know, it scares me a little bit being a dad. I imagine my son, maybe I put my son up on a counter and say, "Fall backwards, Daddy will catch you." And he's horrified and almost refuses to do it. And maybe eventually he gets himself a little bit and Daddy catches him. And then a little bit more and Daddy catches him, a little bit more. And pretty soon he's like, this is great. I just fall back and my dad catches me. And a dad might be a little frightened, like, oh, okay, now make sure I'm ready. Make sure I'm there. Don't just fall back if Dad's nearby. I might not even be thinking about it. And crunch, there you go. Make sure Dad's interested in you falling backwards. And don't just, oh, good, there's my dad. Okay. But the more you prove God, the more excited you are to see him do something again. He called for a prayer meeting. He had like-minded friends that had been through difficulties before. He went to his house. He didn't have to go to a shrine or high on a mountaintop somewhere. You see, following God can be done right in your house. His religion was a everyday home variety. Okay, so what was shared by him and what was shown to him? Verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Okay, so God revealed the secret in a night vision. It could have involved sleep and it could have possibly not involved sleep. It was at nighttime. He could have been resting. Maybe they were praying late into the night, but God showed him the vision. And it reminds us of Peter, who was sleeping. Possibly if Daniel was sleeping here, we think of Peter who was asleep in this scary time in Acts 12:4. Daniel had nothing to fear. Oh, but someone's coming after him. Oh, but that person couldn't come after you unless God allowed it to. When you know the Lord, he's the one that deserves all the fear and respect and the awe and the adoration and the love and every other word you can think of. He's worthy. And when we rest in him, we can know a peace that passes understanding. So we see prayer, and then in verses 20 through 23, we see peace. Prayer gave way to praise, as prayer often will. He did not rush to the king with the news. Some have suggested maybe he wanted to make sure it was correct. But in faith, he began praising God. A couple passages in Psalm 113, 1 through 2, and 103, 1 through 2, speak of praising God continually, forever. But praise. In verse 20, he praised him for his wisdom. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. Wisdom and might are his. Now God is omniscient and omnipotent. He is eternal, forever and ever. Blessed be the name of God. He said in verse 20, God's name is so powerful. Only the word of God is exalted above the name of God. We see in Psalm 138, verse 2. But then we also remember in Acts 4:12 that salvation is through his name and through no other name. We remember from Genesis 4:26 when men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So he praised him for his wisdom. Then he praised him for his ways. Verses 21 and 22. He changeth the times, he said. In verse 9, Nebuchadnezzar accused the wise men of preparing fancy gobbledygook for him. There you go. How about that for a theological term? He knew that they wanted to throw some fancy words together and buy themselves some time until the time be changed. And Daniel pointed out that I serve the one who changes the times. They were hoping that changing times would save their neck. And Daniel said, oh, I actually follow the one who changes the times. So the ways of God, first of all, in removing sovereigns, he removeth kings and setteth up kings. He changeth the times. God is in charge of the times and changing things. We think of Acts 17:26, where talks about, hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the faces of the whole earth. And he sets up the boundaries of man and ocean and everything. God sets the boundaries. He changeth the times and the seasons. It's not fate that changes anything. We serve the great regulator, the one that changes things and rule. The unchanging one is the one who does the changing down here. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. Psalm 75, 6 and 7, Isaiah 10, 5 through 7, and Isaiah 45, 1 and 46, 10 through 11. In removing sovereigns, but he praised him for his ways in revealing secrets, verses 21 and 22. He giveth secrets unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep, secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. His light overcometh all darkness. We remember in Psalm 139 where it talks about the night is just like light to him. Oh, what a difference it makes when the sun is shining and you can see possibly an area of the woods that was so frightening in the dark. When the sun comes up and you can get a good look. Oh my, I was so frightened last night, but look, I can see the night is like the daytime to him. The light of revelation versus the darkness of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Light and darkness. God made the light and separated it from the darkness. He has the wisdom, John 1, 4 and 5. And in fact, James called God the Father of lights. In the end of this verse, Daniel 2:22, and the light dwelleth with him. So he praised him for his ways, and then he praised him for his willingness in verse 23. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. In this praising God for his willingness, it seems like Daniel demonstrates a sense of historical continuity. He talks about the God of his fathers, still the same faithful God. Even though his world was upended, Daniel's was. He realized that God was still the same faithful God of his fathers. Oh, what faith to see the stability of God amidst the instability of the changing times, with Israel seemingly to be no more. Judaism may have been somewhat incapacitated, but Jehovah certainly was not and never would be. He was still historically, theologically superior to all the pagan gods. Daniel also had a sense of humble contentment. You answered our prayers. Thank you. The God of wisdom and might, from verse 20, had given Daniel wisdom and might in verse 23. Our God is gracious with what is his, very giving. God is gracious in revealing the future and the sovereignty over it, and therefore history, to reveal God's goodness to bring salvation to the world through the Jewish nation in the person of Jesus Christ and the eventual rule of Jesus Christ. And next we see Daniel's personal testimony. So this is verses 24 through 30. Verses 24 through 30, Daniel's personal testimony. So before the Babylonian soldier, first of all, his testimony before the Babylonian soldier. All is well. Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. And again, Daniel's not just thinking of himself, but he goes before the soldier and says, hey, stop, don't hurt anybody else. He's thoughtful of other people. Now the question is, were these other people that were saved because of Daniel's intervention and because of the power of his God thankful or jealous? Oh, you won't convince me that part of them wasn't thankful, but I do know that humanity is so forgetful. Oh my, you're not going to die? Why? Because Daniel came through. What? Oh, is he going to be uplifted above me? You weren't even going to be around. You were going to die. What do you care if he's uplifted above you? It's funny. So I'll guarantee, knowing humanity, because I'm one of them, I know there must have been a thankfulness, but how quickly we forget what we should be thankful for. How are we the same way with God? Absolutely. We have salvation, we have this or that, and we're grateful, and then quickly we wonder, well, what about me? What like the disciples. Where will I sit in the kingdom? We think of, in Genesis 40, the man who forgot to remember, the one in prison for whom Joseph interpreted the dream, and then he forgot all about him. They were alive, but they and their gods had been shown up. Pride is a very powerful force. Daniel could have possibly struck a deal in which he was spared and everyone else was killed. There's a good chance that possibly he was already being ostracized by them for his dietary privileges, among other things. Could he have been like Elijah, who killed the prophets of Baal, put down the false prophets? God is gracious even in judgment here. He saved the lost for the sake of the saved. Almost like what he wanted to do, what he would have done with Sodom and Gomorrah, where he would have spared Sodom and Gomorrah if there had been enough righteous people there. But there hadn't been. He brought to naught the wisdom of the world, as God does, 1 Corinthians 1, 25 through 29. Those suffering for God are the ones closest to him. So he's before the Babylonian soldier. First of all, in verse 24, we see the promise. He says, "Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and," here's the promise, "I will show unto the king the interpretation." I will show. Here, this seemingly powerless youth was now in charge of the situation. He tells the soldier, "Bring me before the most powerful man in the world. Come on, chop, chop, step two." And then Daniel pretty soon is standing before Nebuchadnezzar telling him the way things are going to be. This is amazing. Who is Daniel? Just somebody who purposed in his heart to honor God. And all of a sudden, he's going to be here standing before the most powerful man in the world. And then pretty soon the most powerful man in the world is going to be on his face before Daniel. Oh my, God is the great reverser. This is amazing. This is powerful. This is wonderful. So the promise and then the presentation in verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah. It's hard not to act like you saved the day. Arioch didn't save the day. Daniel's about to save the day because of God and God allowing him. But it's hard. Arioch's human. Is like, oh, guess what? I saw a problem and I solved it. I have found a man that will make known unto the king the interpretation. So haste. This is tumultuous haste, trepidation. He attempts to appear industrious. Of the captives of Judah, he says, possibly a repudiation of Babylonianism here too. Possibly Arioch had seen, there's no answers among your wise men. I have found the answers among the captives of Judah. But also at the same time, he seems to be uplifting self. I have found a man, in stark contrast to the humility of Daniel. We think of Ecclesiastes 12:13 that says, the whole duty of man is simply to fear God and keep his commandments. So Daniel's personal testimony before the Babylonian soldier, and then before the Babylonian sovereign, verses 26 through 30. In verse 26, first of all, we see the question asked. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Art thou able to make known? And so he looks at him and says, can you do both? Can you tell me what the dream was and what the dream meant? In verses 27 through 30, we see the question answered. Daniel didn't say, I sure can. He didn't lift up himself, but it's amazing. When you lift up God, God has a way of lifting you up. God exalts the humble. Ezekiel later on is going to think Daniel quite wise in Ezekiel 28:3. God honors the humble. Proverbs 29:23, Luke 14:11, James 4:6, Psalm 75 verses 6 and 7. But Daniel, he doesn't say, I sure can. He speaks of God first. There's a difference between a prophet and a psychic, between a seer and a soothsayer. And there's a difference between the God of heaven and the gods of Babylon. A soothsayer, like our modern day fortune tellers, to cut or divide, to try to guess the outcome of a thing. Not so with God. Daniel's response is going to set the stage for a dramatic event in history. In the audience of the greatest world leader of his day, Daniel initially and preeminently credited not himself and not the wise men, but God, as the only one with whom revelation would come. Daniel negated the power of the polytheistic pantheon of astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers. So the question answered. First of all, we see in verse 27 an exposure. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. Your wise men cannot help you. The Bible declares systems of idolatry impotent many times. Isaiah 40:18, 1 Kings 18:27 through 29, Acts 16:16 through 19. Your wise men cannot help you. This time we do see he included soothsayer, those who profess to tell the future. This undermining of the king's men probably did not at first endear Daniel to the king, but Daniel had learned in a proper way to fear God rather than men anyway. After all, the fear of man bringeth a snare, Proverbs 29:25. You can almost read this verse like a facetious question, but it is a fact. He's just saying, they can't, they can't help you? All your wise men? You haven't found help with? No, it's almost like a facetious question, but it's not a question. He tells him, your wise men can't help you. But, I don't know, men of God have had that funny bone before. Elijah on Carmel. Oh, your wise men weren't able to help you? Is that so? So an exposure of the weakness of these men, the impotence of these men, and then an explanation, verses 28 and 29. He gives the source of the vision in verse 28. He says, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. What powerful words. There is a God in heaven. He is compassionate, not capricious. That idea of being subject to whim. Not like the demon gods of Babylon. Oh, believer, keep God paramount. Not a set of religious values, but God himself. Colossians 1:18. Christ is supposed to be preeminent in all things. The source of the vision would be God. The substance of the vision in verse 29. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. What shall come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. The very God of heaven, unmoved by human frailty, came to you and showed you what should come to pass hereafter. You were lying there in your bed, wondering about the future, as might be expected. And the very revealer of all things, God is the one that reveals the future, no one else. And the revealer of such things showed you. How neat! God wasn't limited to Palestine. He was the one that had made Nebuchadnezzar king over the earth anyway, Jeremiah 27:6. And you can almost see the king, you were lying there in your bed, and oh, I didn't ask you where I was. Can you just tell me what my dream was, and tell me what it meant? It's like, there you were, lying on, it's like, okay, I guess technically it would have been creepy if you could tell me what I dreamed and what it meant anyway, but now you can tell me where I was, and it's almost like everything about my life is naked and open before the things of whom, but before him, naked and open before the one that knows everything. There in Hebrews chapter 4. So then we also see with whom we have to do. Thank you. An explanation in verse 30. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So an explanation in verse 30. So first of all, why the vision was given to the humble believer. So why was the vision given to Daniel? He was given the explanation. Nebuchadnezzar was given the dream. Daniel was given the explanation. Each of them had a vision/dream. So why was the explanation given to a Jew and the dream given to the head of the Gentile powers? He said, not because I am anything special, but, and then at the end, why was the vision given to a haughty Babylonian? It was given for the sake of the living, that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. God had something he wanted to reveal to mankind through this amazing encounter. All right, number 3, verses 31 through 45, we see Daniel's prophetic teaching. He dealt with the latter times. Latter times is found 14 times in the Old Testament, first appearing in Genesis 49:1 concerning Jacob's prophecy for his 12 sons. In Isaiah 2:2, it referred to the millennial kingdom of Christ. The New Testament writers considered the first advent of Christ as the inauguration of the last days, Acts 2:17 and following, Hebrews 1:12, 1 John 2:18. Gentile history is in view here. The times of the Gentiles began with the exile, Luke 21:24, and of course would only end with that stone that would come and obliterate the base of the statue, and that hasn't come yet. So we see the prophetic teaching. The substance of the king's dream, verses 31 through 36. Just like we think of the great churches of the Bible and wonder where they are today, and then consider our church. I look at Fairhaven. Fairhaven seems like it's a larger church. And you wonder if those churches could fade off the scene. What's going to happen to this one someday? Nebuchadnezzar was probably lying there as the head of his nation thinking, am I really going to, we came to power and there's no one that can stand against us, but will that last? Will it last? Other nations have risen and fallen off the scene. Will mine be different? Will my nation last? Most recently, of course, the Assyrian Empire, and before that, the Egyptian Empire. Would any kingdom be greater than his? He had subdued his foes. His fortress was virtually impregnable and contained one of the celebrated 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens. So in verses 31 through 33, we see the details of the image. In verses 31 through 33, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Okay, I've never been to a fortune teller, but I understand that they specialize in vagaries. I see clouds, and there's air. People are breathing, and things like, oh, yes, that happened yesterday. But here with actual prophecy, he's getting specific, frighteningly specific, and in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, the whole dream is coming back to him. This great image. Excellent brightness stood before him, terrible form, head of fine gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, stone. The Aramaic word for stone is identical to the Hebrew word for stone. So this is interesting. Again, we're in that other language here with Daniel, and where the syntax is different, but much of the letters and are the same. But here's a word that's the same. Cut without hands, struck the feet and broke them. All the rest of the image was broken as well, carried away of the wind without a place to land. So we see thou sawest in verse 34, till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet. They were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, clay, and brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together and become like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, so that you couldn't even find the dust when it settled. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and we will tell the interpretation, therefore, before the king. That we will tell. That's interesting, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we see the details of the image and the destruction of the image. Was the king's mouth hanging open at this point? And he hadn't even given the interpretation yet. Young Daniel had just done what all the wise men could not. Obviously, there was something to this youth. Before the king could comment, he continued. In verse 31, thou sawest. Verse 34, thou sawest till. He continued to look, an active pial participle, a continuous gazing. No wonder he was so adamant about getting an explanation. And then he says, we will tell. So the king, Daniel is telling the king, not even just what he's seeing, but how he's seeing it. Thou sawest till, and this is kind of the look about you as you notice these things. And we will tell. Who's this we will tell? Is this the editorial we? No, I think it was probably Daniel, the mouthpiece for the true revealer of secrets, the Lord God. So then we see the significance of the king's dream, verses 37 through 45. 5 kingdoms, 4 of metal and 1 represented as stone, messianic, while the quality, that is the specific gravity, decreases. For instance, gold has a specific gravity of 19.3, and silver has a specific gravity of 10.1, brass 8.5, iron 7.6, clay 1.9. The specific gravity, the quality decreases from top to bottom. The strength increases until the clay, which isn't strong, at the bottom. The image was top heavy. This was an indictment against the so-called evolution of man and society. The image is fragmented on the way down, ending with 10 toes. The initial explanation involved the head and the feet of the image, the beginning of the end of world domination. The in-between portion was passed over somewhat until the later chapters in Daniel. So in verses 37 and 38, we see domination, secular superiority. The prerogative was transferred from Israel to Nebuchadnezzar. Even though his kingdom was the smallest of the world empires listed, he was the most powerful man in the world. In the end, the Antichrist will have a world empire which will suddenly cease with the coming of Christ. And of course, there have been other world empires since then, but they're not listed in the prophecy. Different extensions of kind of parentheses or even fall under Rome's that parentheses between the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire when Christ will come back. The source of Nebuchadnezzar's power in verse 37, we see, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory." God gave it to you. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of the kingdom. The head, their idea is the beginning of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the beginning, the head of the year. He was the most important part of the body, the most precious part of the structure. He was a king of kings. And God is the one that says so. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, 605 to 539 BC, he was a brilliant, powerful man. The Nebuchadnezzar, or the Babylonian Empire, would end just 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. So the source of his power, then the scope of his power, verse 38. "And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." So over the children of men and beasts. Now it's interesting, he's over the beasts, and one day he would become like them when he has the heart of a beast later on, when he is lifted up in pride. The beasts of the field, the fowls of heaven, rules over them. But God is the one that did that. He had rule over them. We remember Romans 13, where it says that God gives government authority. And all the authority that Nebuchadnezzar had, his brilliance and his strength and might and indomitability, that all came from God. So his domination, and then we see deterioration in verses 39 through 43. In verse 39 we see the future kingdoms. "And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth." And again, how is a kingdom inferior going to arise? Well, Nebuchadnezzar will die, and there'll be a ruler after Nebuchadnezzar that's extra inferior to him. And then a king who is just inferior and not extra inferior will be able to overthrow him and take charge. That new kingdom would be Medo-Persia. Another third kingdom of brass, which shall rule over all the earth later on, would be Greece. So the future kingdoms, and then the final kingdom, verses 40 through 43. So first of all, we see in verse 40, the might with which it commences. Verse 40, "And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise." Undoubtedly, this kingdom is Rome. It forms the longest portion of the image, indicating the length of time that it will exist, and it was as strong as iron. Rome began to annex part of the Grecian Empire in 190 BC and culminated annexation in 146 BC. "Breaketh in pieces. She ruthlessly swept through the Near East and subdued much of the Mediterranean basin, including Spain, Gaul, Britain, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Assyria, until the Caesars, the first being Roman, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, until these. Nero was in power from AD 54 to 68. Under his reign, Paul was beheaded through Trajan, AD 98 through 117. And until the sack of Rome by Alaric in AD 410. In AD 413, Augustine wrote his famous De Civitate Dei, City of God, to disprove that Rome fell because Christians rejected the Roman religion for Christianity. Rome was depicted as the strong beast in 7, 11, 19, and 23. So the might with which it commenced. And then we see the mixture, with which it concludes, verses 41 through 43. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the 10 toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. At the bottom was iron and clay. They don't mix. This was the democratic element of the Roman Empire, where iron would be maintained, strength would be in evidence, but where the whims and wishes of the people could prevail, weakness would result. Efforts to weld the two, dictatorship and democracy, would fail, just as trying to weld clay and iron would fail. It would end with the 10 toes. We see that being an analogy to the 10 horns of the fourth beast. The Apostle John confirmed this interpretation centuries later in Revelation 17. The mingling of the seed of men suggests various nationalities, some stronger than others, comprising this future 10-nation Roman Federation. Then we see disintegration in verses 44 through 45. Back in verse 35, the kingdoms became like chaff carried off of the wind. Pusey said, "The intense nothingness and transitoriness of man's might in his highest estate, and so of his own also, and the might of God's kingdom apart from all human strength, are the chief subjects of this vision as explained to Nebuchadnezzar." The image is seen as complete, even with its weak foundation. When the stone strikes, the 10 kings will hold power over all of what these empires held, and then for a brief time, the Antichrist will be a world power. So the disintegration. Underneath this in verse 44, we see the divinely conquered world. First of all, underneath this, the coming of the heavenly kingdom. Verse 44, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." The coming kingdom would consume all these kingdoms. This consuming indicates a unity that goes beyond political, national, or cultural. There would even be a religious unity. The stone kingdom would be very impressive, which is interesting. The soil of Babylon yielded no stones. The buildings were all made of clay and brick. The stone motif is recognizable throughout Scripture. Deuteronomy 32:4, 15 and 18, Psalm 118, 22, Matthew 16, 18, 1 Peter 2, 6 through 8. One cut out of the mountains without hands. The kingdom of Christ will not come by a gradual leavening of mankind with the gospel, but by a catastrophic divine intervention. It will be sovereignly imposed. Christ will crush all opposition at the millennium. The millennial reign heralded by Isaiah and others, Isaiah 35 and Zechariah 14, that would last 1,000 years, Revelation chapter 20. So we see the coming of the heavenly kingdom and the continuance of the heavenly kingdom at the end of verse 44. "It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." The kingdom of the Son of Man shall stand forever. The fifth kingdom has a better sovereign, God versus just a human king, better endurance, forever versus temporal, and better results. It would stand, as opposed to being broken and beyond broken, obliterated without trace. So a divinely conquered world and a divinely confirmed word. Verse 45, "For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. The idea here is trustworthy. Daniel considered God's revelation inerrant and infallible. If this information was to be validated on the history of kingdoms through the millennial kingdom, it would have to be preserved verbally intact. Psalm 12, 6 through 7, and 119, 160. Every one of thy righteous judgments endureth forever. The great God, he was greater than Marduk and Nabu. So we conclude this chapter with Daniel's public triumph in verses 46 through 49. Now, the king's mouth must have really been hanging open. He must have been overawed at this time. First of all, in verses 46 through 47, the king praised Daniel. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth, it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. So he began treating Daniel like a god. He falls on his face and worships Daniel. This is the word that refers to a worship of deities. Now, it doesn't say that Daniel was rejecting it, but we can safely assume he wasn't saying, yes, worship me, knowing that Daniel understood. I can't help but think that he's thinking, well, this is pretty neat, what God just did here. So the king commands an oblation, that's a bloodless sacrifice, and sweet odors, incense, be offered to him. Just as he was proclaimed King of Kings in his dream, he uplifted God as a God of gods. Here God glorifies himself, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. So is this his salvation? Did Nebuchadnezzar get saved here? I think I would say no, absolutely not. Your God is a God of gods. God is amazing. And when man recognizes that God is amazing, that doesn't constitute salvation. It's when God is personalized and received as your own God. So the king praised Daniel, and the king promoted Daniel, verses 48 through 49. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him great many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And again, Daniel's over these other men. Again, how quickly they probably forget that they wouldn't even be in existence if Daniel hadn't saved them. But how forgetful we are. I'll bet you there was jealousy pretty quickly. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So the king made him a great man. He opened the treasury and gave him great many gifts. He was placed over, that is, made ruler of, the whole province of Babylon, a satrap, a protector over the realm, and the chief governor over all the wise men. He was a religious overseer. Daniel sat in the king's gate, possibly some sort of business overseer. If they resented him, we do not see it yet. It did not matter, though, for he rested beneath the shadow of Jehovah's wings and in the secret place of the Most High. Also, he did not forget his friends, like the butler had forgotten Joseph. He did not promote them himself, but mentioned them to the king who promoted them, because he entrusted the integrity and insight of Daniel. The only way for the four teenagers, the four teenage Jewish deportees, to reign in the highest posts of the greatest kingdom of their day was that the sovereign God honored their faithfulness, just like God had honored the faithfulness of Joseph back in Genesis. It would be nice if the testings were now over, but there are problems that come with advancement, just like there are problems that come with adversity. Daniel had to learn to trust God, though. What exciting conclusion, what an exciting conclusion to chapter 2. It'll be exciting to continue our journey with chapter 3 and the rest of the book of Daniel.